Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're embarking on a deep, evidence-based exploration into the very foundation of who we are, our minds. Look, it's no secret that in modern life, we are facing an unprecedented crisis. We're talking digital overload, chronic stress, our attention is completely fragmented, right? We are constantly searching for ways to optimize our focus, enhance our ability to do deep work, and somehow push back against the biological clock. But how do we actually separate viral health myths from rigorous scientific reality? Well, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to dive deep into the interconnected biological systems, from sleep architecture and gut-brain communication to movement and neuroplasticity that literally build lifelong cognitive resilience.
Okay, so let's kick this off with a massive medical detective question, one that has basically fueled a multi-billion-dollar commercial industry. In an era where we rely on apps for literally everything from intuitive eating to sleep tracking, millions of us have downloaded these cognitive training games. The hope, of course, is to inoculate ourselves against cognitive decline, dementia, or just that everyday brain fog. We are so culturally obsessed with this idea of a quick fix for our complex neural networks. We kind of treat our brains like a frozen computer that we can just reboot with a colorful app. But we have to ask, can a simple digital puzzle actually rewire your biological hardware?
Well, the answer begins with a landmark piece of longitudinal research known as the ACTIVE study. And the results here are absolutely mind-blowing. Researchers followed nearly 2,800 older adults for a decade, and they found that participants who completed up to just 23 hours of a very specific type of visual speed training game cut their risk of developing dementia by an incredible 29% decades later. I mean, think about that for a second. That is a staggering finding in the landscape of aging biology. It proves that targeted cognitive interventions can literally echo through our neurology for years.
But hold on a second. Before you go and download every single brain training app on the App Store, you need to hear about this massive $2 million FTC fine levied against Lumosity. They were heavily penalized for making unsupported, unscientific medical claims about preventing Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. And this really exposes a massive contradiction in modern wellness, doesn't it? There's this huge gap between actual emerging neuroscience and aggressive commercial marketing. Because as we'll see today, not all brain training is created equal, and the scientific context matters immensely.
So here is our syllabus for today's explainer. First, the brain game illusion. Second, the science of neuroplasticity. Third, movement as brain medicine. Fourth, the mind diet and sleep. And finally, building your cognitive reserve.
Let's start with Section 1, the brain game illusion. So why do most commercial brain games totally fail to deliver on their grand promises of elevated intelligence and an impenetrable memory? Well, it essentially comes down to a fundamental misunderstanding of how human attention networks and learning actually function in the real world. There is a scientific consensus signed by over 70 leading psychologists and neuroscientists that emphasizes a concept called FAR transfer. See, when you spend hours playing a digital memory matching game, your brain definitely adapts, but it only adapts to make you incredibly good at that specific game. That's called near transfer. But the evidence that getting a high score on your phone translates to far transfer, like, actually remembering where you left your car keys, organizing a massive project at work, or maintaining deep cognitive endurance during a highly stressful day, that evidence is exceptionally weak. You are mastering a micro task, you're not upgrading your overall intelligence.
Moving on to Section 2, the science of neuroplasticity.
So, if most of these isolated digital apps are just an illusion, what actually does work to protect our minds as we age? To answer that, we really have to look under the hood at the foundational science of how the brain physically changes itself. The absolutely crucial point here is neuroplasticity. For the longest time, the pervasive myth was that our brains stopped developing in our 20s, and from there, it was just this slow, inevitable decline. But modern neuroscience has completely debunked this. Neuroplasticity proves that our brains are incredibly, profoundly malleable. Throughout your entire lifespan, your brain possesses the capacity to structurally and functionally reorganize its neural networks. Every single time you learn something challenging, your brain literally builds brand new physical pathways.
Now, this explains why that specific visual speed training in the ACTIVE study actually worked, while standard memory games totally failed. It comes down to engaging deep, durable, implicit learning, rather than just explicit learning. Explicit learning is like memorizing facts for a history test, right? It fades really quickly, but implicit learning is acquiring an unconscious skill, like learning how to ride a bike or drive a stick shift. The speed training in that study forced participants to process complex peripheral visual information super rapidly, which ended up rewiring deeper sensory networks.
And once the brain rewires for these implicit skills, the biological change is incredibly durable. We're talking lasting for decades.
And this brings us to an absolute master concept in healthy aging, cognitive reserve. I want you to think of cognitive reserve as a neurological savings account. Over your lifetime, through your education, complex problem solving at work, and novel experiences, you build up this dense, robust network of alternative neural pathways. So if age-related degeneration or neuropathological damage actually begins to occur later in life, a brain with a high cognitive reserve just simply reroutes its signals right around the damage. You can literally physically have the markers of cognitive decline in your brain tissue, but exhibit absolutely zero clinical symptoms because your reserve is so incredibly vast.
Let's dive into Section 3, Movement as Brain Medicine.
Here's the thing. We cannot optimize our minds while ignoring our physiology. It just doesn't work. The human body operates as one deeply interconnected ecosystem. Physical exercise is essentially the most potent, systematic medication for the brain currently known to science. When you exercise, you are drastically increasing blood flow, improving vascular health, and clearing out cellular debris. But more importantly, aerobic exercise triggers the release of something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Think of BDNF as high-performance, premium fertilizer for your brain. It promotes the growth of new neurons and synapses. Furthermore, studies show regular moderate aerobic exercise actually increases the physical volume of the hippocampus, which is your brain's memory center, by 2%. That is literally reversing years of age-related atrophy. No pill can do that.
And it's not just about logging endless miles on a treadmill either. Different modalities of movement uniquely target specific cognitive functions. For instance, aerobic exercise specifically targets memory and hippocampus size. But resistance training, like lifting weights, that requires intense focus and form, which remarkably strengthens your executive function and cognitive control. And then you have complex mindful movements like Tai Chi or dance. Because these require learning new, intricate physical patterns, they drastically improve verbal reasoning and cognitive flexibility. So a diverse physical routine creates a comprehensively resilient brain.
All right, moving to Section 4, the mind diet and sleep.
So, let's talk about the scientifically validated mind diet, which essentially sits perfectly at the intersection of cardiovascular health and neurology. Our gut microbiome is constantly communicating with our brain, and poor diets that are high in ultra-processed foods drive systemic neuroinflammation. The mind diet specifically combats this by focusing heavily on antioxidant-rich foods. We're talking leafy greens, blueberries, olive oil, and nuts, while, unfortunately for our taste buds, heavily limiting things like red meat, cheese, and sweets. But here's why it matters. These specific foods contain flavonoids and compounds that actually cross the blood-brain barrier to neutralize free radicals and lower oxidative stress. They are actively preventing the cellular damage that leads to cognitive decline.
And the data on this, it's absolutely phenomenal. According to the highly rigorous Rush Memory and Aging Project, high adherence to the mind diet resulted in a cognitive age that was 7.5 years younger in older adults compared to those who didn't follow the diet. 7.5 years. It didn't just slow down their cognitive decline, it essentially rewound the biological clock of their cognitive function. By changing their fuel source, they fundamentally altered their cellular aging process.
But here is the massive catch. All of that brilliant neuroplasticity and high-quality nutritional support, it is completely wasted if you don't optimize your sleep. Sleep is definitely not a passive state. It is an incredibly active, vital biological process. When you hit deep sleep stages, your brain literally shrinks slightly. It does this to allow cerebrospinal fluid to wash away metabolic toxins that accumulated during your day. And then, during REM and deep sleep, your brain performs memory consolidation. It is physically transferring the information you learned during the day from fragile short-term holding right into durable long-term cortical storage. Without optimized sleep architecture, deep work and cognitive endurance are just biologically impossible.
Finally, Section 5, building your cognitive reserve. Okay, let's bring all these systems together into a cohesive, evidence-based blueprint for lifelong vitality. How do we actually synthesize micro-mental health, movement, diet, and learning into our everyday life? It really all comes down to opportunity cost. When you are deciding how to spend your time, you have to weigh the highly limited, isolated benefits of solo software drills against high-opportunity return activities. Look, a brain game engages your eyes and a finger. But hiking a new trail with a friend while discussing a complex topic, well, that requires navigation, spatial awareness, cardiovascular output, emotional regulation, and linguistic processing, all simultaneously. It is a massive, multisensory workout for your neural networks that builds immense cognitive reserve. I absolutely love this insight from Dr. Andrew Budson. He reminds us that social connection and novel experiences are literally some of the most potent cognitive interventions available to us. In our modern era of social isolation and remote work, we tend to forget that the human brain evolved primarily to navigate complex social hierarchies and novel environments. Traveling to a new city or simply having a deep, in-depth conversation with a stranger forces your brain to rapidly adapt, predict, and empathize. That fires up global neural networks in a way a screen simply never could.
So, we've seen the evidence. We've gone from the severe limits of digital brain games to the incredible, undeniable power of neuroplasticity, physical movement, the mind diet, and deep sleep. It's clear that every system heavily influences every other system. Your daily habits are continuously sculpting the physical structure of your mind. So the question isn't whether your brain is changing today. It definitely is. The real question is, knowing that cognitive resilience is a lifelong accumulation of choices, what real-world habits will you start building right now to protect your tomorrow?